These new mRNA vaccines from Moderna and Pfizer are very interesting in the technology they use. You know, a virus attacks a body's cell and takes over and hijacks the mechanism inside a cell to create duplicate copies of itself. It takes from the DNA, there's a duplicate called an mRNA. That mRNA template goes through the machinery of a cell to make the proteins, things like the parts, the spike protein, the other parts of a virus that get assembled and then go on to infect other people as they leave the cell. What both of these vaccines do from Pfizer and Moderna is they are simply that template, that mRNA template that hijacks the cell to create the spike protein. So unlike the virus, which makes entire duplicates of all parts and pieces of the virus, these vaccines work for a little time to create only copies of the spike protein. The spike protein is very important because that's what the virus uses to get into and infect us. With copies of the spike protein floating around in your blood, your immune system ramps up. Anytime there's anything foreign, whether it's a virus, whether it's a protein, whether it's just a spike protein, your immune system starts to create counterattacks for it. Now, in the future, after having been exposed to this mRNA vaccine and having recognized the spike protein, let's say you get exposed to someone with COVID. Those virus particles normally would do their dirty work and make copies of themselves. But because your immune system has been ramped up to recognize spike proteins, they will much more quickly attack the COVID virus particles and disable them. This is the exciting part of this technology. We're taking a page out of the virus's own book and using it against the virus. There are a lot of theories and speculation about what these vaccines will do, and things like they will alter your DNA are actually not true. We know from the science, the way these vaccines were developed, that what they're doing is they're not affecting the DNA, they're coming with a copy of the DNA called the mRNA. So think of the DNA, your basic genetic code, as very important books in a library. And what mRNA is a photocopy of that DNA that your body uses to then create proteins. So in this example, these vaccines are both mRNA vaccines. They're copies of the DNA. They can't affect the DNA. They break down naturally over time. The body breaks down the mRNA anyway. And the mRNA goes into the body's cells and then leverages the ribosomes, the protein factories, to make copies of the spike protein. So it's true that we don't know the long-term effects, perhaps, but given what we know about how DNA and mRNA work and how proteins are built, there really shouldn't be long-term effects beyond which some of the positive effects we know of the immune system ramping up and being able to recognize spike proteins. If you think about the Moderna and the Pfizer vaccines as a recipient, as essentially equivalent, of course, there were differences in how they were made, but what's surprising is how similar they are in how it matters to you. They're both around 95% effective. Both use that same mechanism of targeting the spike protein using an mRNA to create those the spike proteins in your own body. The vaccine from Pfizer seems to be pretty much effective across all age groups and racial and ethnic groups. The Moderna vaccine is also very effective. It may be a little less effective in those age 65 and older, but we don't know for sure because we don't have enough data. Bottom line, get whichever one you're offered. And remember to come back for that second dose, either 21 days later if it's the Pfizer vaccine, or 28 days later if it's the Moderna vaccine. You know, I received the Pfizer vaccine 2 days ago, and the only symptoms I had was a slightly sore arm and perhaps a mild headache for a few hours. And this is actually very common. Most people who've been getting the vaccines have reported very mild arm pain and flu-like symptoms, fatigue, aches, chills, maybe a headache or fever, which go away very quickly. At Stanford and most places administering the vaccine, they had us wait in an observation room for 15 minutes after getting the vaccine before leaving, just to make sure that there's no adverse events or bad things that happen. And if bad things happen, like an allergic reaction, it usually happens in the first 5 or 10 minutes after getting a vaccine. As for the side effects after the second dose, more folks have reported more flu-like symptoms, also transient, that go away very quickly, but because your immune system has appropriately ramped up. If it's going to fight off that spike protein after the second dose, it's that booster shot, so to speak, you almost want to have a better reaction against it. That means you're more protected against COVID, is a way to think about it. It's not unusual to see slight variations in a virus as it evolves and spreads. This is very common with most viruses. What does this mean for us? It means that should that virus strain spread to America, spread to other places, it's likely that it'll spread faster and replace some of the older strains that are spreading. But in terms of other changes to the virus, just because it spreads faster doesn't mean that its spike protein has changed, doesn't mean that the vaccines are not going to work against it. Almost always, when these small changes occur, for example, if this one's spreading faster, that's generally the only change that has occurred. So the vaccines are most likely going to be just as effective against that strain, and it's probably not going to be more virulent, causing more death than the older strains that were around in circulation. So as you know, the Pfizer and the Moderna vaccine are slightly different. You know, the Pfizer vaccine, you're supposed to get the second dose 21 days after the first dose. With the Moderna vaccine, you're supposed to get the second dose 28 days after your first dose. And for both, for the Pfizer vaccine, it seems that it's being 95% effective about 7 days after that second dose. While for the Moderna vaccine, it's been shown to be about 94.1% effective about 14 days after the second dose. So what does this mean? It means that as soon as you get your first dose, doesn't mean you're protected. You have to continue to maintain social distancing and all through your second dose and a week or two after that. And frankly, remember, these are not 100% effective. You should still wear a mask, maintain social distancing, etc., until we get true herd immunity, which will be a year away from now. One of the great stories out of science this year has been how fast these vaccines have been developed. And the reality is, while they were developed quickly, they relied on technology that has been developed over the last few decades. Neither of the mRNA vaccines could have been produced 5 years ago. The technology simply wasn't there. So what happened was a perfect storm of all the right things coming together. We had the vaccine technology advance very quickly. We had the right supply chains, we had the right scientists, and we had the right partnerships between small pharmaceuticals, researchers, large pharmaceuticals, and others. And so what happened was that what normally took 10 years for a vaccine to be developed, because of this new technology, this mRNA technology, for example, very quickly, as soon as the Chinese first released the code of the virus, immediately thereafter, they could start making these mRNA targeting the spike protein um, codes. And this mRNA allowed us to then get from phase 1, 2, and 3 of the vaccine trials very quickly to reach a viable vaccine within a year. Because of the accelerated timeline, people worry that shortcuts were done and the safety that we're used to with other vaccines, those protocols were not maintained. The reality is actually that these are very safe, that to get an emergency use authorization from the FDA requires a very high bar in terms of safety. All of these vaccines before getting that EUA had to go through phase 1 studies where You first give the vaccine to a small number of generally healthy people to see that nothing bad happens. And then you increase doses over time in phase 2 studies. You add more populations that have other conditions at the same time, not just healthy volunteers in phase 2 studies. And then in phase 3 studies, you actually give the vaccine to tens of thousands of people to ensure that something untoward doesn't happen. All of these vaccines that have been approved, both the Moderna vaccine and the Pfizer vaccine, have completed phase 3 studies and have ongoing surveillance, meaning they're watching the people who got the vaccine over time to make sure nothing happens. So these are safe vaccines. And what I always suggest is do what Fauci's doing. If Fauci's taking the vaccine, you should too. Some people think that once you've got the vaccine, life as normal returns. And the reality is that no vaccine is 100% effective. These are at the 94, 95% effectiveness rate, which is very high, but you're not 100% protected. The second thing is these vaccines work through a concept called herd immunity. And what that means is that you need at least 60% of the population or more who are immune to spreading COVID before you can see COVID start to go away in a community or in a population. And that's going to take a lot of time. With our borders open, with people traveling from other countries who may not have access to the vaccine, getting to that 60% level is going to take many months and even maybe a year or more. So until then, please continue to wear a mask. Please continue to protect yourself and your family, maintain social distancing, and whatever public health is saying we should do, we should follow. Certainly the level of restrictions may change over time, but for now, absolutely wash your hands frequently, wear a mask, maintain social distancing, and avoid large groups. With many vaccines, you have to get a booster shot every year. So for example, with the flu shot, it's a yearly shot because the strain changes and your immune system tends to forget over time how to react to a given virus. With the COVID vaccines to date, we don't actually know how long the immunity will last. We haven't had experience with people having had a vaccine for a year to see how your immune system naturally tends to forget how quickly that decline is. So for now, our best guess is that most people who have the vaccine will have probably 6 months or more of relative protection compared to not having the vaccine, but that with different people, that immunity may wane over time. And it's not unlikely that people may need a booster shot a year or more out. So grandma got the vaccine and you want to go visit her. We don't know if it's going to work in grandma. Is she part of the 5% where it isn't as effective? And so to protect grandma and to protect yourself, it's best that you continue to maintain social distancing, wash your hands, meet only outdoors with masks on, and avoid large groups. Don't put her or yourself at risk by assuming immunity. Once you're vaccinated, are you allowed to roam freely, get on airplanes, and do other things that other people won't be able to do? Well, as of today, the only proof you have that you've been vaccinated is a simple piece of paper issued by the CDC that gives the name of the vaccine, the date, and the lot number, things like that. This is pretty easy to forge, and I don't think this will count as a passport of any sort. Over time, there's hope that we might be able to come up with some digital forms of passports where your proof of antibodies or other things might allow you to not have as frequent testing, perhaps. But for now, there is no proof that you've been vaccinated, that you've had COVID that is actually widely recognized or allows you to play by different rules than anyone else.